The day I found the red notice stapled to my cabin door, I felt my blood run cold. In bold black letters it read, "Notice of violation. Shut down order." The morning air carried the familiar scent of pine smoke curling from my fireplace, a smell that had become my sanctuary over the past 2 years. But now, standing on my own porch with that crimson paper fluttering in the mountain breeze, even the comforting aroma couldn't calm the storm brewing in my chest. The metallic sting of the staples had bitten deep into the oak door I'd stained with my own hands, leaving wounds that seemed to mirror the ones forming in my gut. I pulled the notice free, the paper crackling like kindling between my fingers. The HOA letterhead gleamed with corporate authority, Pine Ridge Community Association, as if those words alone could strip away everything I'd built here. My eyes scanned the typed accusations: unauthorized structures, non-compliant exterior modifications, violation of community aesthetic standards. Each line felt like a slap, each phrase designed to reduce my haven to nothing more than a code violation. Property owner must vacate premises within 30 days or face legal action and utility disconnection. Utility disconnection? The words hung in the air like a threat whispered in the dark. They thought they could cut me off from civilization, force me back into the concrete jungle I'd escaped. The audacity of it made my hands shake, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that had been building since the first petty complaint arrived in my mailbox months ago. I'd come to this mountain community for peace. The cabin sat on 3 acres of pristine wilderness, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets to the wind. When I'd first walked this property, I'd felt something I hadn't experienced in decades of city living. Silence. Real silence. The kind that lets you hear your own heartbeat, your own thoughts, without the constant buzz of traffic and sirens and the relentless grinding of urban machinery. The realtor had mentioned the HOA almost as an afterthought. "Just basic stuff," she'd said with a dismissive wave. "Keeping property values up, making sure everyone's on the same page." What she hadn't mentioned was that same page meant surrendering your soul to a board of self-appointed dictators who measured freedom in approved paint, colors and regulation mailbox, heights. Standing there with that notice trembling in my grip, I remembered the day I'd signed the deed. I'd thought I was buying my way out of the rat race, purchasing a slice of the American dream where a man could live as he chose. The cabin wasn't much to look at, a modest A-frame with a stone chimney and wraparound porch, but it was mine, or so I'd believed. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the pine boughs, and I found myself studying every detail of my property with new eyes. The solar panels I'd installed, to reduce my carbon footprint, apparently non-compliant with community aesthetics. The hand-carved wind chimes my late father had made unauthorized decorative elements. The vegetable garden where I grew my own tomatoes and peppers, improper landscaping modifications. Every improvement I'd made, every touch that had transformed this place from a house into a home, had been catalogued and condemned by people who'd never worked a day of honest labor in their lives. The injustice of it burned in my throat like smoke from green wood. I walked to the edge of my porch, looking out over the community spread below me like some suburban fever dream. Identical driveways leading to near-identical houses, each lawn trimmed to regulation height, each fence painted in one of 3 approved colors. It was a monument to conformity, a place where individuality came to die. But something else caught my eye as I surveyed this kingdom of sameness: the power lines. They stretched from house to house like silver threads in a spider's web, carrying electricity to every corner of the development. The lines hummed with current, a sound so constant you learned not to hear it, like the beating of your own heart. Those lines ran up the mountain, through the forest, connecting every home to the main grid. And as I followed their path with my eyes, a slow smile began to spread across my face. Because I knew something the HOA board didn't know. Something that would change everything. The wind picked up, rattling the notice in my hand, and I felt a different kind of electricity. The spark of revelation, of justice waiting in the wings. They thought their piece of paper could cut me off from their world. They thought they held all the cards, all the power. But the wires that lit their houses, that powered their computers and heated their coffee and charged their phones, all those wires ran back to me. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into my pocket. There would be time to deal with this properly, time to show them exactly who held the real power in Pine Ridge. For now, I had some phone calls to make and some documents to review. The HOA had just made the mistake of their lives, and they didn't even know it yet. The pine smoke continued to curl from my chimney, carrying my defiance up into the mountain sky. Let them come with their codes and their complaints. I had something better than their paper authority. I had the grid. 3 years ago, I'd driven up this winding mountain road for the first time with nothing but a broken marriage behind me and a desperate need for silence ahead. The city had nearly killed me, not literally, though the stress-induced heart palpitations had felt real enough, but spiritually. 22 years of corporate law had left me feeling like a husk, going through the motions of a life that belonged to someone else. The divorce had been the final straw. Sarah had taken the house, the cars, most of the savings, and somehow managed to make me feel grateful for the privilege. "You can start over," she'd said, as if 30 years of shared history could be swept away like yesterday's newspapers. Maybe she was right. Maybe starting over was exactly what I needed. The cabin had called to me from the moment I saw the listing. Rustic A-frame on 3 acres, mountain views, private well, septic system, partial solar. The photos showed a simple structure that seemed to grow naturally from the pine forest around it, like something that had always belonged there. When I'd driven up that first time, with the real estate agent chattering about investment potential and HOA protections, I'd barely heard her words. What I heard instead was the whisper of wind through pine needles, a sound like the earth itself breathing. What I smelled was the clean bite of mountain air, untainted by exhaust fumes or industrial smoke. What I felt was space, actual physical space around me, as if the mountains were giving my soul room to unfold after years of being compressed into corporate boxes. The cicadas were singing that first evening, their ancient rhythm echoing off the valley walls as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. I'd stood on the porch, my porch, and felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Peace. Real, bone-deep, cellular peace that seemed to seep into my marrow and remind me what it felt like to be fully alive. I'd signed the papers that same week. The first year had been a revelation. I'd learned to split wood, to maintain the solar panel system, to coax vegetables from rocky mountain soil. My hands, soft from decades of pushing paper, grew calloused and strong. My mind, cluttered with legal precedents and billable hours, slowly cleared like a mountain stream after snowmelt. I was becoming the man I'd always been underneath the suit and tie. Someone who could build things, fix things, create, rather than just argue about contracts and intellectual property rights. But paradise, I discovered, had its serpents. The first complaint had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a woman who introduced herself as Karen Pemberton, vice president of the Pine Ridge Community Association. She was tall and angular, with the kind of sharp features that seemed designed for disapproval. Her voice carried that particular tone of authority that comes from years of running PTA meetings and organizing charity auctions, the sound of someone who'd never met a rule she didn't want to. "Enforce, Mr. Richardson," she'd said, consulting a clipboard that seemed permanently grafted to her forearm. "We've received several complaints about the smoke from your chimney." Our community standards require all residents to use only EPA-approved heating methods. I'd looked at her, then at my chimney, then back at her. It's a wood-burning fireplace. I burn seasoned hardwood that I cut and split myself. Regardless, she'd replied, her pen clicking against the clipboard like a metronome of bureaucracy. The smoke is a nuisance to your neighbors and violates our clean air initiative. That had been the beginning. Over the following months, Karen became a regular visitor, always with her clipboard, always with another violation to document. The solar panels were aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. The vegetable garden was non-compliant landscaping. The wind chimes were unauthorized decorative elements. Each visit left me feeling like a criminal in my own home. Behind Karen came Greg Morrison, the HOA president, a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit. Greg was the kind of person who'd never been given real power in his life, so he wielded his small-time HOA presidency like Napoleon commanding the Grande Armée. His eyes held the hungry gleam of someone who'd found his purpose in making other people's lives miserable. The thing is, Richardson, he'd said during one of his surprise inspections, when you buy into a community like this, you're not just buying property. You're buying into a vision, a commitment to excellence, and frankly, your rustic approach doesn't align with that vision. The third member of their unholy trinity was Martha Hendricks, a woman who specialized in whispered conversations and knowing looks. Martha didn't need an official title to wield influence. She was the community's unofficial information broker, the one who somehow knew everyone's business and made sure the right rumors reached the right ears at exactly the right moment to cause maximum damage. I'd seen her walking past my property at odd hours, always with her phone pressed to her ear, always pausing to study my cabin like she was memorizing evidence for a future trial. Her presence felt like being watched by a predator, something calculating and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The HOA's reputation preceded them throughout the community. They were the reason the Johnsons had been forced to paint their house from cheerful yellow to approved beige. They were why old Mr. Peterson had to remove the memorial garden he'd planted for his late wife because it contained non-native species. They were the force behind 3 families selling their homes and leaving the community rather than fight their endless stream of violations and fines. They get off on the power. My neighbor Jim had told me one evening over beer on his deck. Karen especially. She's like some kind of rule enforcement vampire, sucking the life out of anything that doesn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. Jim's warning had proven prophetic. The harassment escalated throughout the winter. Citation after citation appeared on my door, each one more petty than the last. A fine for having an unapproved doormat. A violation notice for hanging laundry on a line instead of using an electric dryer. A formal complaint about my excessive use of outdoor lighting, meaning the single porch light I turned on after dark. Each piece of paper felt like another bar in an invisible cage being built around my sanctuary. They were methodically, systematically stripping away everything that made this place home, reducing it to just another cookie-cutter property in their suburban paradise. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd fled the city to escape exactly this kind of petty tyranny, only to find it had followed me into the mountains. The same mentality that turns corporate break rooms into battlegrounds over coffee pot etiquette had infected this place like a virus, spreading from house to house until every resident lived in fear of stepping outside the narrow lines of acceptability. Standing on my porch that morning, with the shutdown notice in my hand, I realized I'd been naive. I'd thought I'd bought freedom, but instead, I'd walked straight into their cage. The only difference was that this cage came with mountain views and the illusion of escape. But illusions, I was about to discover, could be shattered. And sometimes, when they break, They reveal truths that change everything. The power lines hummed overhead, carrying electricity to every home in the development, and I found myself listening to that familiar sound with new ears. Soon, very soon, those lines would carry more than just electricity. They would carry justice. The campaign began in earnest the week after Karen's first visit, arriving like a slow-motion avalanche of petty bureaucracy designed to bury me under an endless pile of violations, fines, and legal threats. What had started as occasional complaints evolved into systematic harassment, each day bringing fresh evidence that the HOA board had declared war on my simple desire to live in peace. The letters came first. Official correspondence on Pine Ridge Community Association letterhead, each one more absurd than the last. A violation for illegal wood burning that threatened fines of $50 per day until I ceased using my fireplace. Never mind that wood-burning fireplaces weren't illegal anywhere in the state, or that half the homes in the development had similar chimneys. The law, apparently, was whatever the HOA board decided it was on any given Tuesday. Then came the dawn visits from Karen, materializing at my property line like some suburban specter, clutching her eternal clipboard. I'd wake to the sound of her camera clicking away, documenting my porch furniture, my solar panels, the garden hose coiled beside my steps. The metallic snap-click of her cheap digital camera became the soundtrack to my morning coffee, a rhythm of invasion that made my skin crawl. She never crossed onto my actual property. Karen was too smart for trespassing charges, but she'd stand at the boundary line, her sharp perfume cutting through the clean mountain air like chemical warfare. That sour scent lingered long after she left, clinging to the morning breeze like an accusation. I'd find myself opening windows and burning sage just to clear the air of her presence. "Just doing my job, Mr. Richardson," she'd call out whenever she caught me watching her photographic surveillance. Community standards don't enforce themselves. The fines followed next, delivered in crisp white envelopes that hissed like snakes when they slid under my door. $50 for unauthorized exterior lighting, meaning the single LED bulb I'd installed to replace a burned-out porch fixture. $100 for improper storage of firewood, because I'd stacked my winter supply along the north wall of the cabin instead of in some HOA-approved location that apparently existed only in Karen's fevered imagination. Each envelope carried the same corporate stench of authority, the same implied threat that resistance was futile. Pay the fine or face escalated enforcement actions, whatever those might be. The language was deliberately vague, designed to create anxiety and compliance through uncertainty. The neighbors began reaching out in whispers and worried glances. Jim from next door started stopping by more frequently, always with some excuse about borrowing tools or asking about my solar setup, but really just checking to make sure I was holding up under the pressure. "They did this to the Petersons," he told me one evening, his voice barely above a murmur, even though we were standing on my own porch. Started with small fines, then moved to daily citations, then brought in lawyers. Old Ted fought for 6 months before he just gave up and moved back to Phoenix. Broke his heart, selling that place. His wife had planted every flower in that garden by hand. Other neighbors confirmed the pattern. The Johnsons, forced to remove a children's playhouse because it violated setback requirements. The Martinez family, fined into submission over their choice of fence material. The young couple on Pine Street who'd painted their shutters sage green instead of approved forest green, $27 difference in the color code, $2,000 in fines and legal fees. "They've got a system," explained Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived at the bottom of the hill. "First they identify targets, usually people who don't fit their idea of proper residence. Then they pile on citations until you either comply completely or sell and leave. It's ethnic cleansing disguised as community standards." Her words stung because they rang with truth. Looking around the development, I noticed the pattern she was describing. The remaining residents were overwhelmingly white, middle-aged, and uniformly suburban in their aesthetic choices. Anyone who deviated from that template either conformed quickly or disappeared. The harassment intensified as spring turned to summer. Karen's visits became daily occurrences, her camera documenting everything from the angle of my solar panels to the species of wildflowers growing in my meadow. She measured the height of my grass with a ruler, photographed the grain pattern in my deck stain, and once spent an entire morning cataloging every tool in my storage shed from her position at the property line. Greg joined the surveillance occasionally, arriving in his oversized pickup truck like some suburban sheriff making rounds. He never spoke to me directly during these visits, preferring to communicate through Karen's increasingly creative interpretations of the community covenant. Apparently, my rain barrel violated architectural consistency standards. My compost bin was an unauthorized structure. The bird feeders I'd hung from pine branches were wildlife attraction devices that posed a community safety risk. The absurdity would have been laughable if it hadn't been so relentlessly oppressive. Every morning brought the possibility of new citations, new fines, new invasions of my privacy. I began to understand how authoritarian regimes operated, not through dramatic gestures of oppression, but through the steady erosion of normal life, the constant anxiety of never knowing which ordinary action might be deemed illegal. Martha's role in the campaign was more subtle, but equally insidious. She never visited my property directly, but her influence spread through the community like poison in a well. Suddenly, neighbors who'd been friendly began avoiding eye contact. The checker at the local grocery store started treating me with suspicious formality. I'd catch fragments of whispered conversations that died abruptly when I approached. "I heard he's some kind of environmental extremist," I overheard at the post office. "Karen says he's been burning illegal materials in that fireplace. My sister heard he might be running some kind of off-grid compound up there. Each rumor was carefully crafted to isolate me, to transform me from a neighbor into a threat. Martha understood the power of social pressure, how quickly a community could turn against someone once the right seeds of doubt were planted. The final escalation came in the form of a certified letter that arrived on a scorching July afternoon. I signed for it with hands that shook slightly, not from fear, but from anger that had been building like pressure in a steam engine. The letter was from the HOA's lawyer, a formal notice that the board was pursuing all available remedies to address my continued violations of community standards. The language was dense with legal threats and deadlines, but the core message was simple: comply completely, or face litigation that would seek all available damages, including utility disconnection and forced sale of the property. Utility disconnection. There it was, the nuclear option they'd been building toward all along. They couldn't legally force me to sell, but they could make life so miserable that selling became the only rational choice. Cut off my power, and the solar panels would only carry me so far. Cut off my water, and the well would need electric pumps to function. Systematically strip away the infrastructure of modern life, and even the most determined mountain hermit would eventually surrender. That evening, I sat on my porch with the lawyer's letter spread across my lap, watching the sun set behind the ridgeline. The power lines hummed overhead, carrying electricity to every home in the development. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to smile, because what the HOA board didn't know, what Karen and Greg and Martha and their lawyer had never bothered to research, was that those humming lines didn't just carry power to the community, they carried it from my company. Every light switch they flipped, every air conditioner they ran, every computer they used to type their threatening letters, all of it depended on infrastructure I controlled. They wanted to cut my power? They had no idea they were threatening the man who kept their lights on. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine justice. They thought they held all the cards, wielded all the authority. But real power, the kind that flows through copper wires and transforms entire communities, that power belonged to me. Soon, they would understand the difference between perceived authority and actual control. Soon, they would learn what it felt like to be cut off, isolated, forced to confront their own powerlessness. But first, I had some phone calls to make. The revelation had been building slowly, like dawn creeping over the mountain peaks. But it crystallized that evening as I sat with the HOA's lawyer letter crumpled in my fist and the power lines humming their electric lullaby overhead. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to discover, was that the current flowing through those silver threads above their perfect suburban homes originated from a source they'd never considered: my company, my grid, my power. The story began 15 years earlier, back when I was still trapped in the corporate maze, but had enough foresight to see the writing on the wall. Renewable energy was the future, and smart money was moving early into regional utilities that could adapt to the changing landscape. While my law firm colleagues were still fighting climate change legislation on behalf of coal companies, I was quietly building a portfolio that would transform me from a burnt-out attorney into a significant player in the new energy economy. Richardson Energy Holdings started as a side project, a way to diversify my investments beyond the traditional stock market casino. I'd begun by purchasing shares in struggling rural utility cooperatives, small operations that served mountain communities like Pine Ridge, but lacked the capital to modernize their infrastructure. These co-ops were perfect targets, undervalued, overlooked by major corporations, and desperately in need of the kind of patient capital that could fund their transition to sustainable operations. Pine Ridge Power Cooperative had been one of my first acquisitions. The co-op served this entire mountain region, a territory that included dozens of small communities scattered across 3 counties. When I'd first bought in 7 years ago, it was a failing operation limping along on aging equipment and outdated business practices. The previous board had let maintenance slide, infrastructure crumble, and customer relations deteriorate to the point where state regulators were threatening to revoke their license. I'd seen potential where others saw problems. Mountain communities were perfect laboratories for renewable energy integration, isolated enough to serve as self-contained test cases, but large enough to generate real profits if managed correctly. Over the following years, I'd gradually increased my stake in the cooperative, bringing in modern management practices, upgrading transmission lines, and investing heavily in solar and wind generation. By the time I'd moved to Pine Ridge 3 years ago, Richardson Energy Holdings controlled 67% of Pine Ridge Power Cooperative. Not enough to run it like a private company, but more than enough to determine policy and strategic direction. The irony of buying a cabin in the service territory of my own utility company had amused me at the time. I'd thought it was just a funny coincidence, a quirk of fate that connected my old life to my new one. Now, reading the HOA's threats to pursue utility disconnection, that coincidence felt more like destiny. I walked inside and pulled out the filing cabinet where I kept my business documents, withdrawing a folder thick with contracts, share certificates, and board meeting minutes. The papers told the story of a carefully orchestrated takeover, legal, ethical, and completely invisible to the customers who simply wanted their lights to work when they flipped the switch. The current management team reported to a board of directors that I effectively controlled. The utility's day-to-day operations were handled by professionals who understood that their jobs depended on keeping me satisfied with performance metrics and profit margins. When Richardson Energy Holdings made suggestions about policy changes or infrastructure investments, those suggestions became reality with remarkable speed. More importantly, I had direct relationships with the key personnel who kept the grid operational. Dave Hendricks, no relation to the community gossip Martha, was the chief operations manager, a grizzled engineer who'd worked for Mountain Utilities his entire career. Dave and I had developed a friendship over the years, bonding over our shared appreciation for technical excellence and efficient operations. Sarah Kim was the customer service director, a sharp woman who'd transformed the co-op's reputation from surly bureaucracy to responsive community partner. Sarah understood that utilities were service businesses first, and she'd built a team that treated customers as valued stakeholders rather than necessary nuisances. Most importantly, there was Marcus Thompson, the grid operations supervisor who literally controlled the switches and breakers that directed power flow throughout the region. Marcus was a third-generation utility worker who took pride in keeping the lights on under any circumstances: storms, equipment failures, or unusual requests from major shareholders who happened to live in the service territory. The beauty of the situation was its elegant simplicity. The HOA thought they were threatening a lone homeowner, someone whose only recourse was legal action through overcrowded courts and expensive attorneys. They saw me as isolated, outnumbered, and ultimately powerless against their bureaucratic machinery. What they didn't realize was that their entire community depended on infrastructure I controlled. Every home in Pine Ridge, including Karen's pristine colonial with its perfect lawn, Greg's oversized McMansion with its 3-car garage, and Martha's gossip central command post, drew power from the same grid that I could influence with a simple phone call. The transmission lines that carried electricity into the development ran through substations equipped with remotely controlled switches. The distribution transformers that stepped voltage down to household levels could be isolated or reconnected at the touch of a button. The smart meters that measured each home's consumption could be programmed to implement various service levels, from full power to complete disconnection. I'd never used this access for personal purposes, never even considered it until now. My relationship with Pine Ridge Power Cooperative had always been strictly professional, focused on improving service quality and increasing operational efficiency. The idea of leveraging my ownership position for personal revenge would have horrified me just weeks ago. But that was before Karen had started her dawn photography sessions, before Greg had threatened my home with his petty authority, before Martha had poisoned the community against me with her whispered campaigns, before their lawyer had put in writing their intention to destroy everything I'd built here. They had escalated this conflict beyond reasonable bounds, transforming a simple property dispute into an existential threat to my peace, my home, my carefully constructed new life. If they wanted to play hardball, if they thought they could bully me into submission through coordinated harassment and legal intimidation, then they were about to learn a lesson in the difference between perceived power and actual control. The power lines hummed outside my window, carrying electricity to light their lamps and charge their phones and run their air conditioners. Those same lines could carry darkness, silence, and the kind of vulnerability that comes from realizing you've been picking fights with someone who holds your lifeline in his hands. I reached for my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found Dave Hendricks' number. It was getting late, but Dave was a night owl who often worked on system maintenance during off-peak hours. He answered on the second ring. "Dave, it's Tom Richardson. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Never too late for you, Tom. What's on your mind?" "I need to understand our service protocols for the Pine Ridge development. Specifically, our policies around selective service interruptions for maintenance purposes." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dave was smart enough to recognize when a conversation had layers beneath its surface. "Meaning?" "Well," he said slowly, "we have full remote control capability for that entire grid section. Smart meters, automated switches, individual service controls. We can isolate specific addresses or entire neighborhoods for maintenance, emergency response, or other operational requirements. And the timeline for implementing such interruptions? Immediate. We can execute selective shutdowns from the operations center with about 30 seconds notice. Restoration times vary depending on the specific nature of the interruption. Interesting. And our legal authority to implement such measures. Dave chuckled, a sound that suggested he was beginning to enjoy this conversation. Tom, you control 67% of this cooperative. Your legal authority to make operational decisions is pretty much absolute, as long as we're operating within regulatory guidelines, which include maintenance shutdowns for system upgrades and safety inspections. Absolutely. In fact, we're required to perform regular maintenance that sometimes involves temporary service interruptions. It's not just legal, it's mandatory for safe operations. I thanked Dave and ended the call, then sat back in my chair with a growing sense of anticipation. The HOA board thought they were the predators in this relationship, circling a wounded animal they could bring down through persistence and superior numbers. They had no idea they'd been stalking a wolf. Outside my window, the power lines continued their electric song, but now I heard it differently. It wasn't just the hum of electricity flowing to suburban homes. It was the sound of justice waiting to be served, of karma preparing to complete its circuit. They wanted me in the dark. What they didn't realize was that I could plunge them into darkness with one phone call. Soon, they would understand exactly who held the real power in Pine Ridge. The weeks following my conversation with Dave Hendricks brought an unexpected shift in the community dynamics around me. While Karen, Greg, and Martha continued their relentless campaign of harassment, other voices began emerging from the shadows. Neighbors who'd been watching the HOA's tactics with growing unease, residents who'd felt the boot of bureaucratic oppression on their own necks, and recognized a fellow victim when they saw one. Jim Patterson had been the first to reach out openly, but he wasn't alone. The network of opposition to the HOA's authoritarian rule ran deeper than I'd realized, connecting households throughout the development like an underground resistance movement. These weren't troublemakers or rebels. They were ordinary people who'd grown tired of living under the thumb of petty tyrants, disguised as community leaders. Mrs. Chen invited me for tea one afternoon, a carefully planned meeting that she insisted we hold in her sunroom, where our conversation couldn't be overheard by passing dog walkers or Martha's intelligence network. She served jasmine tea in delicate porcelain cups, while telling me stories that made my blood boil. "The Kowalski family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the privacy of her home. They lived in the blue house on Maple Street. Beautiful Polish couple with 3 young children. The HOA forced them out because Helena liked to hang traditional Polish decorations during holidays. Karen called them culturally inappropriate displays and fined them every time they put up anything that didn't look like standard American Christmas decor. Toddy. Story continued with details that painted a picture of systematic cultural suppression. When the Kowalskis had tried to fight back, Martha had launched a whisper campaign about foreign influences and people who don't understand American values. The family had endured 6 months of escalating harassment before finally selling their home at a loss and moving to a more tolerant community. 2 counties over. That's when I understood what they were really doing, Mrs. Chen said, refilling my teacup with hands that trembled slightly. This isn't about property values or community standards. It's about creating the kind of neighborhood where only certain types of people feel welcome. The Petersons had been next, targeted for the crime of aging gracefully. Ted Peterson had worked for the Forest Service for 30 years before retiring to Pine Ridge with his wife, Eleanor. They'd bought a modest ranch house and spent their savings creating a memorial garden for their daughter who'd died in a car accident. The garden was beautiful. Native wildflowers and medicinal herbs arranged around a small stone bench where Eleanor could sit and remember. Karen called it non-compliant landscaping. Jim told me during one of our evening conversations. Said the wildflowers attracted rodents, and the stone bench violated setback requirements. They fined Ted $200 a week until he agreed to remove everything and plant approved grass instead. But the final blow had come when Eleanor was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. Ted had installed a small greenhouse where she could continue her gardening therapy, a simple structure that provided her with purpose and joy during her difficult adjustment to cognitive decline. The HOA had classified it as an unauthorized outbuilding and demanded its immediate removal. Ted came to the board meeting with medical documentation from Eleanor's doctors, Jim continued, his voice tight with anger. Explained how the greenhouse was part of her treatment, how gardening helped slow the progression of her symptoms. Karen listened to the whole presentation, then voted to uphold the violation. Said medical needs didn't supersede community standards. The Petersons had sold their home within 2 months and moved to assisted living in Phoenix. Eleanor's condition had deteriorated rapidly after losing her garden, and she'd passed away the following winter. Ted blamed the HOA for accelerating his wife's decline, and Jim said the old man still sent Christmas cards with updates about his loneliness and regret over leaving the mountains. These stories accumulated like evidence in a criminal case, each one revealing another facet of the HOA's systematic oppression. The Martinez family fined for speaking Spanish in their own backyard because neighbors complained about language barriers. The young mother, who'd been cited for hanging cloth diapers on a line because disposable diapers were more appropriate for community standards. The elderly veteran who'd been forced to remove his flagpole because it exceeded the approved height limit by 6 inches. They pick their targets carefully, explained Sarah Williams, a nurse who lived in the development's quieter section. Usually people they think won't fight back. Minorities, elderly residents, single parents, anyone who doesn't fit their image of the ideal neighbor. But they've gotten bolder lately, more confident in their power. The resistance network had been forming organically, neighbors supporting each other through whispered warnings and covert assistance. When someone received a violation notice, others would document the same violations throughout the community, proving selective enforcement. When fines were levied, residents would contribute to legal defense funds. When harassment escalated, witnesses would step forward with testimonies and photographic evidence. The problem is that most people can't afford to fight them legally, Sarah explained. The HOA has insurance that covers their legal costs, so they can drag out disputes indefinitely. Regular homeowners can't match that kind of financial staying power. But my situation was different, and the resistance network sensed it. I wasn't just another victim they could support morally. I was someone with resources, connections, and most importantly, the kind of stubborn determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. "You're our best chance," Mrs. Chen told me bluntly during another tea meeting. "You have the education to understand their legal tactics, the financial resources to fight back, and most importantly, you're not afraid of them." The network began providing me with intelligence that transformed my understanding of the HOA's operations. Karen's photography sessions weren't random harassment. They were part of a systematic documentation process designed to build legal cases for forced compliance. Greg's surprise visits were timed to coincide with specific activities, suggesting surveillance of my daily routines. Martha's gossip campaigns were coordinated attacks designed to isolate targets before the official harassment began. More damning was evidence of financial irregularities. The HOA's books showed board members approving expensive consulting fees paid to companies owned by their relatives. Community funds were being used for research trips to other developments, trips that coincidentally aligned with board members' family vacations. The insurance policies that covered their legal harassment were unnecessarily expensive, purchased from companies that provided kickbacks to board members. "They're not just bullies," Jim concluded during one of our strategy sessions. "They're criminals. The problem is proving it in court when they control all the official records and have lawyers on retainer." The intelligence network also revealed the full scope of Martha's influence operation. She maintained detailed files on every resident, cataloging personal information gathered through gossip, observation, and what appeared to be systematic snooping. License plate numbers, visitor patterns, shopping habits, medical appointments. Martha tracked it all with the dedication of a professional intelligence operative. She knows when your Amazon packages arrive, when you get prescription deliveries, when you have overnight guests, Sarah told me with genuine fear in her voice. It's like living under surveillance by the Stasi. Except the Stasi never pretended to care about your property values. But the resistance had been watching Martha too, and they'd discovered something interesting. Her surveillance was so obsessive, so detailed, that it had crossed legal lines. She'd been photographing the interiors of homes through windows, recording private conversations from public spaces, and maintaining files that contained medical and financial information obtained through questionable means. She's been doing this for years, Mrs. Chen explained, building dossiers on everyone in the community, looking for leverage she can use against anyone who challenges the board's authority. But she's not as careful about covering her tracks as she thinks. The revelation? That Martha was essentially running an illegal surveillance operation against her own. Neighbors added another layer to my growing strategy. The HOA thought they were fighting a simple property dispute with an uncooperative homeowner. What they didn't realize was that their own tactics had created the evidence needed to bring them down. If that evidence could be properly documented and presented. Karen escalated the campaign against me by calling me out at a monthly HOA meeting, turning what should have been routine community business into a public humiliation attempt. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland multi-purpose room decorated with inspirational posters about community values and working together. About 30 residents attended, most of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "We have a serious situation developing in our community," Karen announced from behind a folding table that served as the board's official platform. "One resident has consistently refused to comply with our community standards, despite repeated attempts at education and cooperation." She gestured toward me with the flourish of a prosecutor presenting key evidence. I sat in the back row, maintaining neutral expression, while residents turned to stare at me like I was some kind of exotic criminal. "Mr. Richardson has been cited for numerous violations over the past several months. Unauthorized modifications, non-compliant landscaping, inappropriate exterior decorations, and now he's threatening legal action against this board for simply doing our job." The presentation continued for 20 minutes, with Karen reading from a prepared statement that made me sound like a dangerous radical threatening the very fabric of suburban civilization. Greg nodded along like a trained seal, occasionally adding comments about property values and community standards. But something unexpected happened during Karen's performance. Other residents began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Whispered conversations started in multiple corners of the room. By the time Karen finished her presentation, the atmosphere had changed from supportive to suspicious. When she opened the floor for comments, Mrs. Chen stood up with surprising steadiness for a woman in her 70s. "I have a question about selective enforcement," she said, in a voice that carried clearly through the room. "Mr. Richardson is being cited for solar panels, but the Hendersons have had solar panels for 3 years without any citations. He's being fined for gardening, but half the community has vegetable gardens. Can you explain why some residents are exempt from these standards?" The question landed like a bomb in the quiet room. Karen's composure cracked for just a moment before she recovered. With a plastic smile, "Each situation is evaluated, individually based on specific circumstances and community impact. What specific circumstances make Mr. Richardson's solar panels different from the Hendersons' solar panels?" Mrs. Chen pressed. Karen fumbled for an answer while Greg's face reddened. Other residents began asking pointed questions about the selective nature of enforcement, the financial cost of the legal harassment, and the authority of the board to impose standards that weren't clearly defined in the community covenant. I sat silently through the entire exchange, watching Karen's authority crumble under the weight of questions she couldn't answer convincingly. When the meeting finally ended, several residents approached me with expressions of support and offers of assistance. "We see what's happening here," said a man I'd never met before. "And a lot of us are tired of being afraid of our own HOA." Walking home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Hope. Not just hope for my own situation, but hope that the community might finally be ready to stand up to the bullies who'd been terrorizing them for years. But I also felt something else. Anticipation. Because every lie Karen had told during that meeting, every laugh Greg had given at my expense, every whispered comment from Martha's surveillance network, I'd logged it all. The resistance had provided me with evidence, allies, and moral support. Soon, very soon, the current would run against them. And when it did, the entire community would see exactly what happened when you picked a fight with someone who controlled the power grid. The lines hummed overhead as I walked up my driveway, carrying electricity to every home in the development. Tomorrow, I would make another call to Dave Hendricks. It was time to begin the next phase of this war. The special board meeting was called for a Thursday evening in late August, when the summer heat still pressed against the mountains like a suffocating blanket, and the air conditioning units throughout Pine Ridge hummed with constant effort to maintain suburban comfort. Greg had announced the meeting with unusual fanfare, promising decisive action and final resolution of what he termed the Richardson problem. I'd received my official invitation. The same day as everyone else, a notice printed on HOA letterhead, announcing that the board would present their formal findings regarding my continued violations and implement comprehensive enforcement measures to protect community standards. The language was designed to sound official and intimidating, like a court proceeding where the verdict had already been decided. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, carefully orchestrating a response that would turn their moment of triumph into the most public humiliation any HOA board had ever experienced. The community center filled slowly that evening, residents arriving with the reluctant shuffling of people summoned to witness an execution. The usual suspects took their customary seats. Karen's allies clustered near the front. Martha positioned strategically to observe reactions and gather intelligence. The resistance network scattered throughout the room to avoid appearing coordinated. I arrived precisely on time, walking through the main entrance with a leather portfolio tucked under my arm and an expression of calm confidence that I'd practiced in my bathroom mirror. Several residents nodded as I passed, small gestures of support that didn't go unnoticed by Martha's scanning radar. The board had arranged themselves behind their folding table with unusual ceremony. Greg wore what appeared to be his best suit, a navy blue polyester monstrosity that made him look like a small-town mayor at a ribbon cutting. Karen had dressed for battle in a severe black blazer that matched her mood and her soul. Even Martha had upgraded from her usual surveillance casual to what looked like funeral attire. "Thank you all for attending this important meeting," Greg began, his voice carrying the pompous authority of someone who'd finally found an audience that couldn't escape. "We're here tonight to address a situation that has tested our community's commitment to the values and standards that make Pine Ridge a desirable place to live." The presentation began with Karen reading from a prepared statement that cataloged my alleged violations with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor seeking the death penalty. Each citation was presented with photographic evidence, detailed descriptions of community impact, and calculated estimates of property value damage. The performance was thorough, professional, and completely damning. If you ignored the selective enforcement, manufactured violations, and outright lies embedded in every accusation. The board has exhausted all reasonable attempts at cooperation and compliance, Karen continued, her sharp voice cutting through the air conditioning hum like a blade. Mr. Richardson has shown contempt for our community standards, disrespect for his neighbors, and flagrant disregard for the legally binding covenant he signed when purchasing his property. She paused dramatically, consulting her clipboard like a judge reviewing sentencing options. Therefore, this board has unanimously voted to pursue all available remedies under our community covenant and state law. Effective immediately, we are implementing comprehensive enforcement measures including daily fines, legal action for covenant violations, and a formal request to Pine Ridge Power Cooperative for utility disconnection pending compliance. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Several residents shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the escalation from harassment to what amounted to forced exile. This wasn't just about property standards anymore. It was about the board's power to destroy anyone who dared challenge their authority. Greg took over the presentation with visible satisfaction, clearly savoring what he believed was his moment of ultimate victory. The utility disconnection request has already been filed, he announced, waving a document that appeared to be some kind of official correspondence. Pine Ridge Power Cooperative has confirmed that service termination can be implemented within 48 hours of board authorization. Mr. Richardson will have exactly 1 week to achieve full compliance with all community standards, or face complete disconnection from electrical service. Martha practically glowed with vindictive pleasure, her carefully maintained expression of concerned community member slipping to reveal the predator underneath. This was the moment she'd been orchestrating since the first whispered campaign began. The public destruction of someone who'd dared to resist her network's authority. Furthermore, Greg continued, the board has engaged legal counsel to pursue financial damages for property value impacts, community disruption costs, and legal fees incurred during this enforcement process. We estimate Mr. Richardson's violations have cost this community in excess of $50,000, and we intend to recover every penny. The threat was clear and comprehensive. Comply completely or face financial ruin, social isolation, and exile from the only place that had felt like home in years. It was the nuclear option, designed to terrify not just me, but anyone else who might consider challenging the board's absolute authority. But they had made one critical error in their moment of triumph. They had assumed I was powerless, isolated, dependent on their mercy for the basic necessities of modern life. They had threatened to cut my power without bothering to research exactly who controlled the wires that kept their own lights burning. I stood slowly, my movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the room. All eyes turned to me as I walked calmly to the front of the room, my leather portfolio held loosely at my side like a weapon I hadn't yet chosen to draw. Thank you for that comprehensive presentation, I said, my voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet room. I particularly appreciate Mr. Morrison's confidence in Pine Ridge Power Cooperative's willingness to disconnect my service. It shows remarkable faith in an organization you clearly don't understand very well. I placed my portfolio on a nearby table and opened it with deliberate precision, withdrawing a stack of documents that I'd organized in careful order. The papers rustled in the air-conditioned silence like autumn leaves announcing the changing season. Since you've chosen to make this a public proceeding, I think the community deserves to understand exactly who they're dealing with, both in terms of their HOA board and in terms of the neighbor you've been trying to destroy. The first document I held up was a stock certificate, the kind of official paper that represents real ownership in the modern world. Several residents leaned forward, trying to read the small print that would change everything. Richardson Energy Holdings, controlling shareholder of Pine Ridge Power Cooperative, I announced, letting the words sink in like stones dropped into still water. 67% ownership, established 7 years ago, with full authority over operational decisions including service connections and disconnections. Karen's face went white as printer paper. Greg's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land. Martha's expression shifted from predatory satisfaction to something approaching panic. "You see," I continued, walking slowly along the front of the room like a professor delivering a lecture, "when you threatened to have my power disconnected, you were essentially asking me to disconnect my own service, which is certainly within my authority, but hardly the devastating blow you imagined." I held up the next document, a corporate, organizational chart showing the relationship between my holding company and the local utility, cooperative. But that's not the most interesting part of this situation. The really fascinating aspect is that every home in this development, every air conditioner currently running to keep you comfortable, every light that illuminated your drive to this meeting, all of it runs on infrastructure that I control. The silence in the room had become something physical, a pressure that seemed to compress the air itself. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the almost subliminal electrical sounds that form the background soundtrack of modern life. "Now, you might think I'm here to threaten you with power disconnections," I said, my voice remaining calm and reasonable. "But that would make me no better than the bullies who've been terrorizing this community for years. Instead, I'm here to demonstrate something more important." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my cell phone, a simple gesture that somehow felt loaded with significance in the charged atmosphere of the room. "Dave, it's Tom Richardson," I said, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear both sides of the conversation. We discussed the maintenance shutdown schedule for Pine Ridge development. "Are you ready to implement the planned power interruption?" "Standing by for your authorization, Tom," came Dave's voice through the phone's small speaker, professional and matter-of-fact. "We can execute selective shutdown for the entire development grid with about 30 seconds notice." Several residents gasped. Greg started to stand up, then seemed to think better of it and remained frozen halfway between sitting and standing. Karen clutched her clipboard like a shield that might protect her from the reality crashing down around her. "Before we proceed," I announced to the room, "I want everyone to understand that this is a maintenance demonstration only. Service will be restored within minutes, but I think it's important for the community to understand exactly how their electrical infrastructure works." I looked directly at Greg, then Karen, then Martha, making sure each of them understood that their moment of triumph had become something else entirely. "Execute the maintenance shutdown. Dave, shutdown initiated. Pine Ridge development going dark in 10, 9, 8. The countdown echoed through the room like the seconds before New Year's midnight. Except, instead of celebration, there was only the growing horror of people realizing they'd been picking a fight with someone who held their lifelines in his hands. 3, 2, 1. Shutdown complete. The lights flickered once, like the community center was taking a deep breath. And then everything went dark. The air conditioning died with a mechanical sigh. The fluorescent lights above us faded to black. Even the red exit signs dimmed and went silent. In the darkness, I could hear gasps, murmurs, the shuffle of feet as people tried to orient themselves in the sudden absence of electrical civilization. Someone's phone flashlight clicked on, then another, creating small islands of blue-white light in the black ocean of the meeting room. But I could see more than just the meeting room. Through the windows, the entire Pine Ridge development had vanished into darkness. Streetlights, porch lights, the warm glow from living room windows, all of it extinguished in an instant. The only lights visible were the distant glow of neighboring communities, places that existed on different electrical grids, places that hadn't declared war on the man who controlled their power supply. "Service restoration in progress," Dave's voice announced through my phone speaker, still calm and professional despite the drama of the moment. "Pine Ridge development coming back online in 10 seconds. The lights flickered back to life with the mechanical enthusiasm of machines grateful to resume their purpose. Air conditioners hummed back to life, fluorescent bulbs flickered and stabilized, and the familiar background hum of electrical civilization resumed its constant presence. But something fundamental had changed in that brief moment of darkness. The power dynamic in the room, in the entire community, had shifted as dramatically as the lights themselves. I looked around the room at faces that ranged from shocked to terrified to something approaching awe. These people had just experienced a demonstration of real power, the kind that flows through copper wires and transforms the basic conditions of modern life. "In that blackout," I said quietly, "I hope you realize something important. You haven't just been harassing a neighbor who wanted to live in peace. You've been picking a fight with the man who keeps your lights on." Greg had gone completely pale, his pompous authority evaporating like water in desert heat. Karen sat frozen behind her clipboard, all her sharp confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone who'd just learned that her weapons were toys and her authority was an illusion. Martha had disappeared entirely, slipping out through the emergency exit during the blackout like the coward she'd always been underneath her surveillance and whispers. "The maintenance demonstration is complete," I announced to the room. "Your electrical service is secure and will remain so because, unlike some people in this room, I don't use power to bully and intimidate my neighbors." I gathered my documents and returned them to the portfolio, taking my time to let the lessons settle into the minds of everyone present. But I want to be very clear about something. The harassment stops now. The violations, the fines, the surveillance, the legal threats, all of it ends tonight. Because you've just learned that in any conflict between perceived authority and actual power wins every time. I walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back to face the stunned room. "Oh, and Greg? You might want to withdraw that utility disconnection request. I'd hate for people to think the HOA board doesn't understand how basic infrastructure works." The community center door closed behind me with a satisfying click, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at their light switches the same way again. Outside, the Pine Ridge development glowed with restored electrical life. But everyone knew now that the glow existed at my discretion. The power lines hummed overhead with their familiar electric song, but the melody had changed. It was no longer the sound of suburban comfort. It was the sound of justice served, of bullies brought low, of a community finally free from the petty tyrants who'd terrorized them for too long. The war was over, and everyone knew who had won. The aftermath of the blackout demonstration rippled through Pine Ridge like aftershocks from an earthquake, each tremor bringing down another piece of the HOA board's crumbling authority. By Friday morning, less than 12 hours after the community center meeting, Greg Morrison's resignation letter had appeared in every resident's mailbox, a hastily typed document that cited personal reasons and family obligations without acknowledging the real reason for his sudden departure. I learned the details from Jim Patterson, who'd witnessed Greg's middle-of-the-night exodus from his oversized McMansion. Apparently, Greg had spent most of Thursday evening on his phone, frantically calling HOA insurance companies, lawyers, and anyone else who might help him understand the legal implications of threatening to cut power to someone who owned the power company. The conversations hadn't gone well. His wife was loading boxes into their SUV at 2 in the morning, Jim reported with barely concealed satisfaction. Moving truck showed up at dawn. By the time most folks were drinking their coffee, the Morrison house was empty and for sale. The speed of Greg's departure spoke to more than just embarrassment. It suggested panic, the kind that comes from realizing you've committed acts that might have legal consequences. Karen's photography surveillance, Martha's intelligence gathering, and Greg's coordination of the harassment campaign suddenly looked less like community service and more like conspiracy. Harassment and possibly criminal intimidation tactics. Karen lasted 3 more days before following Greg's example, though her departure was messier and more public. She'd apparently spent the weekend consulting with lawyers, trying to find some way to salvage her position or at least avoid personal liability for the board's actions. The consultations hadn't been encouraging. She tried to claim she was just following HOA procedures, Sarah Williams told me during a chance encounter at the grocery store. But when the lawyers started asking for documentation of those procedures, actual written policies that would justify her surveillance and selective enforcement, she couldn't produce anything. Karen's resignation came in the form of a rambling, defensive letter that blamed outside agitators and legal technicalities for undermining what she still insisted were legitimate community standards. The letter was distributed to residents on Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, a moving truck was parked outside her pristine colonial house. "Funniest thing," Mrs. Chen observed during one of our afternoon tea sessions. She kept all those files on everyone in the community, but she never bothered to research the one person she was actually targeting. If she'd spent half as much time investigating you as she did spying on the rest of us, she might have avoided this whole disaster. Martha's departure was the most satisfying, partly because it was the most complete. Unlike Greg and Karen, who left behind resignation letters and forwarding addresses, Martha simply vanished like smoke in the wind. Her house went dark one evening and remained that way. No moving truck, no explanation, no forwarding address for mail delivery. She just disappeared, Jim marveled when we discussed it the following week. Like she was never here at all. Even her landline has been disconnected. Martha's abandonment of her intelligence operation left behind a treasure trove of evidence that the new HOA board would find fascinating. Her house, now technically abandoned property, contained filing cabinets full of surveillance photos, detailed records of residents' personal information, and documentation of the harassment campaigns she'd orchestrated against previous targets. It's like she was running her own private Stasi operation, Sarah observed when the interim board began cataloging Martha's abandoned files. Photos taken through windows, records of medical appointments, even copies of people's mail that she somehow obtained. Half this stuff is probably illegal under privacy laws. The power vacuum left by the board's collapse created an opportunity for the community to rebuild its governance structure from the ground up. The resistance network that had formed around my situation emerged as the natural leadership for Pine Ridge, with Mrs. Chen accepting the role of interim president and Jim Patterson volunteering to serve as interim treasurer. Their first order of business was a comprehensive audit of the HOA's finances, and what they found made the departed board's harassment tactics look almost innocent by comparison. Years of financial irregularities had drained the community's reserve funds while enriching board members and their associates through a complex web of inflated contracts, unnecessary expenditures, and outright theft. The landscaping contract was being paid to Greg's brother-in-law's company, Jim reported during the first public meeting of the interim board, except the brother-in-law was charging premium rates for services that were never actually performed. "We've been paying for weekly lawn maintenance on common areas that don't exist." The insurance policies that had funded the board's legal harassment were another scandal. The community had been paying exorbitant premiums for coverage that primarily benefited board members engaged in personal vendettas rather than legitimate HOA business. The previous board had essentially used community funds to finance their campaigns against residents they didn't like. Karen charged the HOA for her camera equipment and photography supplies, Sarah discovered during her review of expense records. She claimed it was for community documentation, but we now know she was using it to stalk and harass neighbors. The audit revealed financial misconduct totaling more than $200,000 over the past 5 years. Money that should have been used for actual community improvements. but had instead financed the board members' personal projects and petty tyrannies. More importantly, the audit exposed the systematic nature of the harassment campaign against multiple residents. The departed board hadn't just targeted me, they'd used similar tactics against at least a dozen other households, always following the same pattern of selective enforcement, manufactured violations, and escalating pressure designed to force compliance or departure. The Kowalski family case was even worse than we thought, Mrs. Chen reported with visible anger. Martha had been photographing their children playing in their own backyard, claiming she was documenting noise violations. Some of these photos were taken with telephoto lenses through their bedroom windows. The evidence pointed to potential criminal charges beyond simple HOA misconduct. The surveillance activities crossed into stalking territory. The financial irregularities suggested embezzlement or fraud, and the coordinated harassment campaign might constitute conspiracy charges under state law. The interim board voted unanimously to forward their findings to the county prosecutor's office and the state attorney general's Consumer Protection Division. Within weeks, investigators were interviewing residents, subpoenaing records, and piecing together a case that would eventually result in criminal charges against all three former board members. But the legal system moved slowly, and in the meantime, the community had to heal from years of authoritarian rule. The interim board began systematically reversing the previous administration's most oppressive policies, starting with a comprehensive review of all outstanding violations and fines. Every citation issued in the past 2 years is being re-evaluated, Jim announced at a packed community meeting. If we can't find clear, objective justification for a violation based on the actual language of our community covenant, the citation is void and any associated fines are refunded. My own violation file was among the first to be reviewed, and the results were almost comical. Of the 37 citations I'd received, exactly 0 were based on actual covenant violations. The solar panels, vegetable garden, wind chimes, and every other alleged infraction had been manufactured by a board that confused personal preferences with community law. Your cabin is actually one of the most covenant-compliant properties in the development, Sarah informed me with a smile that contained years of suppressed frustration. Everything you've been cited for is either explicitly allowed by our governing documents or falls into areas where the covenant is silent, which means it's automatically permitted. The refund check for my accumulated fines was substantial enough to fund a nice vacation, but more important was the symbolic victory it represented. Every dollar returned was an acknowledgement that the harassment had been illegal from the beginning, that the board's authority had been largely imaginary, and that the community was finally free from their petty tyranny. The transformation of Pine Ridge was immediate and dramatic. Residents who had been afraid to make any modifications to their properties suddenly began expressing their personalities through their homes. Colorful gardens bloomed where sterile lawns had been mandated. Decorative elements that reflected cultural heritage and personal taste appeared on porches and in yards. Children's playhouses and swing sets sprouted in backyards that had been kept artificially pristine. It's like the community finally woke up from a bad dream, Mrs. Chen observed during one of our tea sessions. People are actually talking to each other again, instead of worrying about who might be reporting them to the board. The interim board also addressed the underlying structural problems that had allowed the harassment to flourish. New policies required board meetings to be recorded, financial records to be independently audited annually, and enforcement actions to be reviewed by a community panel before implementation. Most importantly, they established clear procedures for removing board members who abused their authority, including immediate suspension for anyone found to be engaging in harassment, surveillance, or financial misconduct. We're making sure this can never happen again, Jim explained. The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it. We lost sight of that distinction, and look what happened. But the most satisfying change was cultural rather than procedural. The fear that had permeated Pine Ridge for years, the constant anxiety about whether your lawn was the right height, whether your decorations were approved, whether someone was watching and documenting your every action, had evaporated like morning mist in sunlight. People walked taller, smiled more readily, and began treating their neighbors as friends rather than potential informants. The community that Greg, Karen, and Martha had tried to control through intimidation became the kind of place it should have been all along. A neighborhood where people chose to live because they enjoyed each other's company, not because they feared each other's judgment. Standing on my porch that autumn evening, watching families enjoy their yards without fear of citation, listening to the sound of children playing without worry about noise violations, I felt something I hadn't experienced since moving to Pine Ridge. Genuine community pride. The power lines still hummed overhead, carrying electricity to every home in the development. But now their song sounded different. No longer the backdrop to oppression, but the foundation of freedom. The lights they powered illuminated homes where people could live as they chose, express themselves as they wished, and sleep peacefully without fear of dawn surveillance or morning citations. The people who had once stapled notices of fear to doors throughout the community now walked past their former kingdom in shame. Exiled from the paradise they'd tried to rule through intimidation. Their authority had been revealed as the illusion it always was, while real power, the power of community, justice, and basic human decency, had triumphed. Justice, it turned out, really was sweeter when it came with a side of poetic irony. 2 years have passed since the night the lights went out on the Pine Ridge HOA board, and the transformation of our mountain community continues to amaze me. What began as a personal battle against petty tyranny has evolved into something much larger. I'd demonstration of how quickly a community can heal when freed from the poison of authoritarian rule and allowed to rediscover its better angels. The physical changes are everywhere. Look, Mrs. Chen's front yard now showcases a stunning array of traditional Chinese flowering plants that bloom in sequence throughout the growing season, creating a living calendar of color that draws admirers from neighboring communities. The space where Martha once lurked with her surveillance equipment has been transformed into a community message board where neighbors post announcements about lost pets, garage sales, and informal gatherings. Jim Patterson built the workshop he'd always dreamed of, complete with solar panels that supplement his grid connection and a small windmill that generates power for his woodworking tools. The structure would have sent the old HOA board into apoplectic fits of regulatory outrage, but it perfectly embodies the new Pine Ridge spirit, functional, environmentally conscious, and beautifully integrated into the mountain landscape. The Kowalski family returned last spring, purchasing a larger home 2 streets over from their original property. Helena's Polish decorations now grace their new porch year-round, and their children's laughter echoes through the neighborhood without fear of noise violation citations. Their homecoming was celebrated with a block party that would have been impossible under the old regime. Too loud, too informal, too joyful for the previous board's vision of proper community behavior. My own cabin has become something of a symbol, though I never intended it that way. Visitors often stop to admire the solar panels that were once deemed architecturally inconsistent, the vegetable garden that was labeled non-compliant landscaping, and the wind chimes that were classified as unauthorized decorative elements. Local newspapers have written articles about the solar cabin revolution, and I've received inquiries from other HOA-oppressed homeowners seeking advice on fighting back against bureaucratic bullies. But the real transformation runs deeper than visible improvements or symbolic victories. The culture of fear that pervaded Pine Ridge for years has been replaced by something rarer and more valuable: genuine community spirit. Neighbors actually know each other now, not as potential sources of violation reports, but as friends, allies, and fellow travelers on the journey of mountain living. The monthly community meetings that once felt like tribunals now resemble old-fashioned town halls where people gather to solve problems collectively, rather than assign blame individually. Recent discussions have focused on practical matters like organizing a volunteer fire department, establishing hiking trail maintenance crews, and coordinating bulk purchases of heating oil for the winter. It's like living in a real community instead of a corporate housing development, Sarah Williams observed during our most recent meeting. People actually care about each other instead of just monitoring compliance. The legal aftermath of the board's collapse provided its own satisfaction. Greg Morrison pled guilty to embezzlement charges and was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security prison plus full restitution to the HOA's depleted accounts. Karen Pemberton faced charges related to stalking and harassment, ultimately accepting a plea deal that included probation, community service, and a restraining order prohibiting her from holding any HOA office for 10 years. Martha Hendricks proved more elusive, having apparently disappeared into whatever underground network exists for disgraced community surveillance operatives. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit tracked her across 3 states before losing her trail somewhere in Nevada, where she'd apparently assumed a new identity and begun integrating herself into another unsuspecting retirement community. I sometimes wonder if her new neighbors have any idea what kind of predator has moved in among them. The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Civil lawsuits against the former board members, their accomplices, and the various contractors who'd participated in the financial fraud ultimately returned more than $400,000 to the community's accounts. These funds have been invested in genuine improvements, upgraded playground equipment, enhanced internet infrastructure, and a community solar garden that reduces everyone's electrical bills while demonstrating sustainable energy principles. Richardson Energy Holdings has thrived alongside the community's renewal. The success of Pine Ridge's transformation into a model sustainable community has attracted attention from urban planners, environmental activists, and other utility cooperatives seeking to replicate our approach. We've become a case study in how small-scale renewable energy systems can power both individual homes and community-wide change. More importantly, the cooperative has expanded its service territory to include several neighboring communities, bringing reliable, affordable, environmentally conscious electrical service to rural areas that had been neglected by larger utility companies. Each new community we serve benefits from the lessons learned during Pine Ridge's transformation, the importance of local control, community input, and leadership that serves rather than rules. But the legacy I'm most proud of extends beyond improved infrastructure or legal victories. Pine Ridge has become a beacon for other communities struggling under the weight of petty authoritarianism disguised as governance. We receive regular visits from residents of other HOA-controlled developments, people seeking advice on how to reclaim their communities from boards that have forgotten their proper role as servants rather than masters. The thing people don't realize, I often tell these visitors, is that most HOA tyranny survives only because people believe it's legitimate. Once you understand that authority without accountability is just bullying with paperwork, the emperor's clothes disappear pretty quickly. The educational aspect of our transformation has led to the establishment of the Pine Ridge Community Institute, an informal organization that documents best practices for community governance and provides resources for residents fighting HOA overreach. Our website receives thousands of visitors monthly, and we've helped coordinate successful reform movements in dozens of communities across the country. We've also become a model for what I call responsive infrastructure, utility systems that serve communities rather than exploiting them. When people understand that their electrical grid, water systems, and communication networks can be owned and controlled by the communities they serve, it changes their entire relationship with these essential services. Most people think utilities are like weather, natural forces they have to accept but can't control. Dave Hendricks explained during a recent conference presentation. But utilities are just businesses, and businesses can be owned by anyone with the capital and commitment to serve customers properly. This philosophy has spread beyond Pine Ridge to influence utility policy throughout the region. 3 more mountain communities have established community-owned electrical cooperatives, 2 have implemented municipal broadband networks, and 1 has created a local water authority that serves residents at cost rather than maximizing profits for distant shareholders. The success has attracted attention from less savory sources as well. Corporate utility companies have lobbied state regulators to restrict community ownership options, arguing that local control leads to inefficiency and higher costs. Their arguments would be more convincing if they weren't contradicted by our consistently lower rates, higher reliability scores, and superior customer satisfaction ratings. Similarly, HOA management companies have begun including anti-Richardson clauses in their standard contracts, attempting to prevent communities from implementing the kind of accountability measures that ended the Pine Ridge Board's reign of terror. These clauses are largely unenforceable, but their existence demonstrates how our example has rattled the industry of professional community controllers. The most meaningful legacy, though, exists in the daily lives of people who no longer live in fear of their own community governance. Children play in yards without generating noise complaints. Gardeners grow vegetables without facing fines for inappropriate landscaping. Homeowners install solar panels, wind chimes, and decorative elements that reflect their personalities rather than some committee's vision of suburban conformity. Last month, I received a letter from Ted Peterson, the elderly man whose wife had been forced to abandon her memorial garden before they fled Pine Ridge under the previous board's harassment. Ted had read about our community's transformation and wanted to thank us for proving that bullies don't always win. "Eleanor would have loved to see what you've accomplished," he wrote. She always believed that communities should nurture the things that make people happy, not punish them for being different. You've built the kind of neighborhood she dreamed of, and I hope other communities follow your example. Standing on my porch this evening, watching the sun set behind the mountain ridge line, I'm struck by how much has changed since that morning when I found a red violation notice stapled to my door. The cabin that was once targeted for destruction has become a symbol of successful resistance. The power lines that carry electricity throughout the development no longer hum with the threat of disconnection, but with the promise of energy independence and community control. The vegetable garden that generated so many citations now produces enough surplus to supply a small farmer's market that operates in the community center parking lot every Saturday. The solar panels that were deemed architecturally inconsistent have become the model for similar installations throughout the development. The wind chimes that were classified as unauthorized decorations still sing their mountain song, but now they're joined by dozens of others as neighbors express their own personalities through sound and motion. Most importantly, the fear that once permeated every interaction in Pine Ridge has been replaced by something much more valuable: trust. Trust that neighbors will support rather than spy on each other. Trust that community leaders will serve rather than rule their constituents. Trust that conflicts can be resolved through conversation rather than citation. The transformation hasn't been perfect or complete. We still face challenges with county zoning regulations, state utility policies, and the occasional neighbor who misses the old system of rigid control. But these challenges feel manageable because we face them together. As a community that has learned to value cooperation over compliance, creativity over conformity. The lesson of Pine Ridge extends far beyond HOA reform or utility ownership. It's about the fundamental question of how we want to live together, whether we'll surrender our freedom to petty authorities who promise security in exchange for compliance, or whether we'll take responsibility for creating the kind of communities where human dignity and individual expression can flourish. We chose dignity. We chose expression. We chose to remember that communities exist to serve their residents, not control them. As the last light fades from the western peaks and the power lines begin their evening song, I think about the words I spoke that night in the darkened community center. They thought they could unplug me. Instead, I pulled the plug on them and lit a path for everyone else. The path we lit has become a highway now, traveled by communities across the country that have learned they don't have to accept tyranny disguised as governance. The light we kindled has become a beacon, visible to anyone willing to look beyond the artificial authority of bureaucratic bullies to the real power that flows from community cooperation and mutual respect. The HOA tried to shut down my cabin, thinking they could force me back into the darkness of urban anonymity and corporate control. They didn't realize that I owned their entire power grid, not just the physical infrastructure, but the moral authority that comes from serving rather than ruling, from lighting rather than extinguishing, from empowering communities rather than controlling them. In the end, they discovered what bullies always learn when they pick the wrong target. Real power doesn't come from the ability to harm others, but from the capacity to help them flourish. And in a contest between those two kinds of power, there's never really any doubt about which one will win. The lights of Pine Ridge glow brighter now than they ever did under the old regime, powered not just by electricity, but by the infinitely renewable energy of human freedom. And that light will keep shining as long as people remember that they don't have to live in the dark, no matter who tries to flip the switch. The power, as it turns out, was always ours. We just had to remember how to use it.